Chapter 14 of Aristopia by Castello, Newton, Holford. From the time Henry Morton returned from his first exploring expedition beyond the mountains, the immigrants, already overflowing the 5-mile radius around Mortonia, were directed up the Potomac to form new settlements, and when the governor returned from England, the outmost settlement was more than 40 miles above Mortonia. Now they were extended still more rapidly, for Morton acquired new vessels and extended his agencies in Europe. The object was to push beyond the mountains, and small settlements were made along the Potomac a few miles apart, located at places where the best agricultural land was found. These settlements were made as compact as possible for safety from the savages, and each contained a strong blockhouse and stockade, with 2 or 3 small pieces of artillery. Each settlement, consisting of 25 or 30 families, constituted a township, with its local government of 3 supervisors, town clerk, justice of the peace, and constable. In each was located a store of the Commonwealth. Each had its school and school officers. For teachers of these schools, young women were brought from England, scions of gentle but impoverished families who preferred coming to America to the slavish life of a dependent or governess for some ill-tempered woman of rank or wealth. Good roads were made to connect the settlements. The burden of making these roads was not laid upon the settlements, but the work was done by a body of labourers in the employ of the Commonwealth, although really paid by the governor. Signals were arranged to consist of 3 reports of a cannon, to give warning of an attack upon any settlement. At this signal the people were to retire to the forts, and the attacked settlement was to receive all possible succour from its neighbours. No hostilities with the Indians had yet occurred, but the settlers were warned not to put any trust in the savages, which might some time prove fatal. At the same time, the Indians were treated with justice and friendliness. Such land as the settlers of Aristopia needed was bought of the Indians at prices satisfactory to the latter. It was not long before the chain of settlements extended from Mortonia, beyond the high plateau forming the watershed between the Potomac and the streams which flow northward into the Ohio, and descended to those streams. It was now decided to prepare to remove the capital of Aristopia from Mortonia to a point beyond the mountains. A new city, named Morgania in honour of a prominent official of the colony, was laid out on the middle one of the 3 large streams between the head of the Potomac and the Ohio. At this site was a fine waterfall, with an ample volume of water to turn many mill-wheels. The valley was broad and fertile enough to support a large agricultural population. The ranges of mountains or hills which bounded the valley were full of iron ore and coal, although the value of the latter was little known at that time. But there was timber enough to make charcoal to smelt iron for a nation. Soon after the site of this future capital was laid out and its settlement begun, a chain of trading posts from the Ohio to the great river was established. The first one, called Onondio, was situated on the southeastern bank of the Ohio, at the mouth of a large creek in latitude 39 degrees 40 minutes. The second was on the same side of the Ohio, at the mouth of a river afterward called the Little Kanawha. The third was at the mouth of the Great Kanawha River. The fourth was on the north bank of the Ohio, at the mouth of a river called the Scioto. The fifth was at a very beautiful location on the north bank of the Ohio, about 100 miles below the mouth of the Scioto, and opposite the mouth of a considerable river coming in on the south side of the Ohio. The sixth was about 120 miles farther down the river than the fifth. At this point were rapids in the river, which considerably impeded navigation. The seventh was near the mouth of the Wabash River. As the ground at the mouth of the Ohio was unfit for settlement, and the point was considerably without the chartered limits of Aristopia, no post was established there. The 8th post was established on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, about 150 miles by the river above the mouth of the Ohio, and near the mouth of a considerable river. This post was named from the river Kaskaskia. Another post established 100 miles farther up the great river on the western bank, on a high and commanding place, was called Carondelet. Some 20 miles above the last post, the explorers found another mighty river pouring a turbid flood into the Mississippi on the western side. These posts were situated near the mouths of rivers navigable for long distances by Indian canoes. Facilities were thus given to the Indians for bringing in from an immense region their furs and peltries to trade. Thus the fur trade of Aristopia soon came to exceed that of Canada. Although the furs were not quite so good as those of more northern latitudes, the skins intended for leather, as those of the deer and elk, were of the best, while in the matter of buffalo skins Aristopia had almost a monopoly. As a means of communication between these posts, horseboats were built, 3 or 4 of which plied between Onondio on the upper Ohio and the post at the mouth of the Wabash. From this post to Kaskaskia the communication was overland, and the distance about 100 miles, mostly over a prairie region. 1 horseboat plied between Kaskaskia and Carondelet on the great river. As the people at the posts raised their own corn and vegetables, there was no great bulk of goods to be brought to them, and as they had only furs and peltries to ship away, there was no great weight to export, so that frequent trips were not necessary. Though the colonists of Aristopia were not allowed to furnish the Indians firearms or other deadly weapons, they rendered them great assistance in getting furs and peltries by furnishing them steel traps. When civilized people are brought into close contact with barbarism, as were the first European settlers of America, there is a great temptation with many of them to plunge into that barbarism and themselves become semi-barbaric. This was notably the case with a large portion of the settlers of Virginia. They did not congregate in communities and build towns, but scattered out on separate plantations. Very many of the younger sons of English "gentle" families, and many disbanded soldiers, unused to manual labour but attracted by the free life of the New World, settled on the frontiers of the colony, and raising only an acre or 2 of corn, depended for the rest of their subsistence on hunting and fishing, and procuring the few necessaries of civilized commerce with peltries, the spoils of their guns and traps. With the advance of settlement, these men and their descendants, frontier life having become a passion with them, pushed on to new frontiers. Though such a life produced a race of men with some prominent virtues, among them great courage and self-reliance, yet it tended to a mode of living not much above barbarism. Such a life appeared to Ralph Morton very undesirable, and he laboured to keep his people out of it and in a state of civilization even superior to that of Europe. Therefore he laboured to keep the settlements compact and prevent straggling in the march of empire. The few in whom the desire to plunge into barbarism seemed irrepressible were selected to man the distant trading posts. Most of these men took Indian wives, and their children, although having some undesirable characteristics, formed a medium between the 2 races by no means without its value to the colony. With a view to facilitate as much as possible communication and commerce between the transmontane country and the sea, the governor bravely undertook the work of constructing a navigable canal from Mortonia to a point near the head of the Potomac, paying most of the expense from his private means. In about 2 years the canal was constructed to a point above the Great Falls. Although this advanced navigation little more than 10 miles, it was very beneficial by bringing down to Mortonia a great flow of water, with all the fall needed to run many mills, as at the upper edge of Mortonia the canal was more than 30 feet above the surface of the river. From this point it was conducted down to tide level by a series of locks. This section of the canal first completed offered much greater difficulties than any section of equal length subsequently constructed, as 20 locks were needed in 10 miles. The mills at Mortonia contained not only great saws for cutting planks from logs, but smaller saws and lathes for cutting timber into all shapes for all sorts of manufactures. Thus, by the aid of water power, handles were made for all sorts of tools, hubs and other parts of waggons, furniture, etc. Furniture could be shipped to England and Holland and sold at a good profit, the separate pieces, packed closely, to be put together, polished and painted or varnished by workmen in Europe. The abundance of good cabinet woods in America made this traffic large and profitable, and not only did the mills of Mortonia work wood, but iron also, by means of lathes, great hammers, and ponderous steel rollers for rolling iron into bars and sheets, all driven by water power. All such work was then done in Europe by unaided human muscle. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Aristopia by Castello, Newton, Holford. Governor Morton was especially desirous of procuring immigrants from Switzerland, a hardy, industrious, intelligent, and moral race. As the poor resources of the country could not support her increasing swarms, many of the people were desirous of emigrating. Many of her young men were sent as mercenaries in foreign wars, and as a consequence there was a superabundance of women in Switzerland, while in Aristopia there was a deficiency. So particular effort was made to induce unmarried Swiss women to come to Aristopia. The fare of all these emigrants was paid down the Rhine to points accessible to Governor Morton's vessels, in which they were given free transportation to America, as indeed were all other emigrants to Aristopia. In some of the cities of northern Italy, as Genoa, Milan, and Venice, were some of the most skilful workmen in the world, and many of the people of that region, particularly of Savoy, were Protestants, severely oppressed by their rulers and desirous of emigrating. Governor Morton had 2 of his ships ply regularly between Genoa and Mortonia, bringing emigrants from Genoa. In 1618 the 30 Years' War in Germany broke out. It was the custom of that age to hold prisoners of war for ransom, in default of which they were sold into servitude, differing from slavery principally in being for a term instead of for life. Governor Morton's agents purchased thousands of these prisoners, who, on taking the oath of allegiance to the government of Aristopia, were shipped thither to become citizens in due time. The families of such of them as had families whose whereabouts could be discovered were brought over to America. During this war the theatre of military operations was horribly devastated, the war being one of peculiar bitterness. Myriads of women and children, their houses burned, their property destroyed or carried off, and their male relatives killed, were driven into the fields and woods to perish with hunger and exposure, or subsist miserably on roots and herbs. Thousands of these unfortunates were picked up by Governor Morton's agents and shipped to Aristopia, where they found comfortable homes, and the women were soon married. Governor Morton also, at his own expense, founded and sustained orphan asylums at Mortonia and Morgania, in which thousands of orphans brought from European cities were reared and educated, both intellectually and industrially, into good, capable, and industrious citizens of Aristopia. They acquired the Aristopian spirit more readily than the adult immigrants, as they had not so many European prejudices to overcome. That the heterogeneous materials gathered in so many countries, of different sects, nationalities, and languages, did not assimilate without some effervescence, may easily be imagined. There were many broils, especially on religious matters, which gave Governor Morton much uneasiness, but they passed over without serious consequences. Religious bigotry in Aristopia was to that in Europe as vaccinosis is to smallpox. In Aristopia was seen what Campbell sings of Wyoming, "For here the exiles met from every clime, and spoke in friendship every distant tongue. Men from the blood of warring Europe sprung, were but divided by the running brook." The children of all these differing peoples grew up Aristopians all, differing in creed, it is true, but never dreaming of attempting to suppress the creed of others or force their own views upon others. They were all educated from the same books in the public schools, where no sectarian doctrines were allowed to be taught. That the ideas of the age demanded something in the nature of religion in schools, Governor Morton could not deny, but he persuaded the people to be contented with the reading in the schools of a volume composed of the 4 Gospels, with simple historical comments to enable the children to understand the literal meaning of the words, but all attempts at doctrinal comment or explanation were excluded. The version used was the King James, but in the reformed spelling, as were all the school books of Aristopia. Governor Morton had established a large printing office, which every year turned out many thousand volumes of works of useful knowledge. He employed persons in England not only to make translations of works in Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish, but to rewrite, in a concise and popular style, works written in a prolix and antiquated style of English. These works were published in Aristopia, of course in the reformed spelling and grammar, and a copy of each was given to every school library. Learning this language in their school books, the children adopted it as their own, and there gradually grew up an Aristopian language which may be described as a perfected English. While the colony of Aristopia was thus advancing with giant strides, but so quietly as to attract little public attention in England, the colony of Virginia still crawled feebly along with its strange miracles of misery. There was not a single village or hamlet in the colony except Jamestown, and that was smaller after 20 years than it was 2 years after it was founded. Each family lived isolated, every planter a petty lordling with his black slaves, for negro slavery had been introduced, and white indentured servants, the latter hardly less slaves than the former. Indeed, the laws of both Virginia and Maryland made it punishable with death for one of these white servants to run away, a crime described with grim quaintness as a theft of himself. Many friendless persons, especially orphan boys old enough to do considerable work, were kidnapped in England and Scotland and sold into servitude in Virginia. Many of these indentured servants escaped into Aristopia. The government would not shelter these persons officially, nor prevent their masters from retaking them, not wishing to embroil itself with the neighbouring colonies, but there were not lacking persons in Aristopia to assist the fugitives to pass swiftly and secretly over the mountains to the remote western settlements, so that one could hardly ever be retaken by his master. As to negro slavery, as soon as Governor Morton's attention was called to it, he foresaw the evils it would bring, as well as its inherent wrong, and he hastened to urge, and soon procured a constitutional amendment declaring that slavery or involuntary servitude, except for crime, should never exist in Aristopia. Considering the depraved public sentiment respecting slavery then existing in England, and still more in other parts of Europe, this provision was a very advanced one. In its relations with England, no other law of Aristopia was so hard to be enforced against the will of the mother country as this law against slavery, for after the abdication of James II., when Parliament had set up Dutch William as the King of England, the kingdom was ruled by Parliament, which was itself ruled by the trading and manufacturing classes. These classes did their utmost to force negro slavery upon the colonies. Each class had its own reason for this. The manufacturers wanted the colonies to produce only raw materials, which alone could be produced by slave labour. The traders wanted the same thing, as it would increase their trade with the colonies, and they wanted also the profit of the slave trade. In 1622 the Indians made a wholesale massacre of the scattered colonists of Virginia. The outbreak did not extend to the settlements of Aristopia, but it was a startling warning to them. In 1627 it was estimated that there were less than 2,000 white persons living in Virginia out of the 7,000 sent there and their progeny. In 1620 a settlement of the Puritans was made in what afterward became the colony of Massachusetts. Arriving in the early part of a terrible winter, nearly destitute on account of the hard terms the Dutch and London merchants made with them in furnishing them passage, there was a great deal of suffering and death, much of it caused by what Captain Smith called "the humorous ignorances of your Brownists." But the Puritans, while professing to esteem worldly things very lightly, were too practical and shrewd long to retain any humorous ignorances of their surroundings, and the colony was soon very successful, considering the severity of the climate and the sterility of the soil. In 1632 Cecil Calvert established a colony whose first settlement was a near neighbour of Mortonia, being near the mouth of the Potomac. Calvert obtained a charter almost exactly like that of Morton. His grant included, roughly speaking, the territory bounded on the east by the Atlantic, on the north by the 40th parallel, and on the south and east by the Potomac, and a line drawn across the eastern peninsula on about the 38th parallel. His colonists immediately had to fight for their grant with a Virginia adventurer named Claiborne, and many years afterward Calvert's successor was beaten out of a large part of his grant by that shrewd Quaker, William Penn. Calvert was a Catholic, and for a long time the majority of the settlers of his colony, called Maryland, were Catholics. The colony was fairly successful from the start. They found the Indians of the western shore friendly, and never had any trouble with them, but some of the tribes of the eastern shore were vicious and hostile. Tobacco soon became and remained almost the only product of Virginia and Maryland. It was, in fact, their currency and legal tender. While tobacco was largely cultivated in Aristopia, and could be cultivated better than corn on steep hillsides, it never became the principal product of the colony, although people of Aristopia had a great advantage over those of Virginia in selling their tobacco. Almost every plantation in Virginia fronted on one of the several navigable rivers. Ships from England and Holland anchored in front of the plantation, took on the planters' tobacco, and unloaded the goods in which it was paid for. Each planter acted for himself. He consigned his tobacco to some English or Dutch merchant, who allowed him what he pleased for the tobacco, in goods the price of which was fixed by the merchant. The helpless planter was allowed just enough to keep him from utter despair, and from refusing to raise and ship any more tobacco. All the tobacco exported from Aristopia was sent by the Commonwealth to one of the governor's agents in England, and a fair price insured. A small profit went to the Commonwealth, serving instead of a tax to pay public expenses. Governor Morton early saw that the vast new continent presented for subjection to human control a vaster field than could be conquered by unaided human muscle in centuries, whatever myriads of the surplus population of Europe his gold would enable him to ship over. He saw that the wilderness must be conquered by machinery, and that the wants of the people engaged in the conquest must be ministered to by machinery, driven by water power to do whatever work could be done by stationary machines, and propelled by horse power where locomotive machines must be employed. Agricultural implements and the methods of using them were among the first improvements made. Ploughs were greatly improved, and it was found that Indian corn could, after the land was freed from roots and numerous stumps, be cultivated with small light ploughs much more easily than with hoes by hand, as the Indian squaws had done the work. The governor himself, having great inventive faculties, invented the grain cradle to take the place of the ancient sickle, and a brush scythe, with a short thick blade heavily braced for cutting bushes and brambles, in place of the English billhook. Governor Morton saw, too, that his transmontane colony, not able to export much of its crude products to Europe, as the 300 miles or more of land carriage would be too expensive, must manufacture for itself especially heavy and bulky articles. And to do this profitably, with so many hands needed so much in subduing savage nature, would require better machinery than the world had yet seen. Many skilful mechanics from Holland, Flanders, Genoa, Venice, and the free cities of Germany had come to Aristopia. These were stimulated by hope of reward, both of money and honour, to invent new machines and improve old ones. Laws were passed either allowing the inventor of a mechanical device the sole right of making and selling it for a term of years, or, if the Commonwealth saw fit to manufacture the device, obliging it to pay the inventor a premium, better understood as a royalty, on each article. But these premiums should not aggregate more than $10,000, for it was not thought meet that the Commonwealth should enrich any of its citizens to such an extent as to enable them, if so disposed, and most rich men are so disposed, to oppress or corrupt their fellow citizens. But there was a reward to be coveted by inventors which could hardly become dangerous to the Commonwealth: honour. Men in all ages and under all forms of government have coveted titles. Civilized or barbarous, royalist or republican, all are ready to risk life, endure suffering, and even give up wealth for titles, or, in other words, honour. When titles are bestowed on the worthy, and do not carry with them undue power, or a revenue wrung by privilege and monopoly from the people, and are not hereditary, giving to a person, however unworthy, power and honour merely on account of what his father did or was, they are something not to be rejected and despised by a wise social economy. So it was enacted that the governor of Aristopia should bestow titles of honour on persons of conspicuous merit, or who had rendered signal service to the Commonwealth. Prominent among those to be so rewarded were inventors. These titles were not to be hereditary, nor carry with them any pecuniary reward or revenue, nothing but a gold medal or badge and a ribbon. Among the great needs of the Commonwealth was a machine for the rapid and cheap manufacture of nails. The great increase in the production of lumber by the invention of sawmills made it possible to build a board house much more quickly than a log one, and when built it was more cleanly and sightly. But the cost of hand-made nails, many of which were needed in a frame house, was a great drawback. Stimulated by promised rewards, and encouraged by the governors bearing the expense of their experiments, some mechanics soon produced a practicable nail machine, which, with a single attendant, could cut from a thin strip of iron as many nails in a day as 100 men could make by hand in the same time. Building was thus cheapened in Aristopia, and nails were made for export. The machine was kept a secret, although it would hardly have been adopted in Europe if known. Such was the prejudice against machinery in the Old World. When some progressive person ventured to introduce a new machine in Europe, mobs of workmen destroyed it, lest it should displace them and cut off even the poor wages they received. But in Aristopia the poorest workmen had no fear of machinery. None was so dull as not to see that the vast continent offered work which every available hand, aided by every possible machine, could not do in generations. Governor Morton, foreseeing the danger that individuals, through wealth obtained by whatever means, might own and control machinery to such an extent as to oppress labourers, used every device of statecraft, first to prevent any dangerous accumulation of wealth in the hands of individuals, and next to accustom the people to the public control of great aggregations of manufacturing machinery. A thing which Governor Morton very much desired, but which he did not see until he was very old, was machinery for spinning and weaving driven by water power, replacing the spinning wheel and hand loom by which cloth was then produced, a work which fell with great weight on the patient, drudging housewife. Chapter 16 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. One of the most destructive scourges of mankind in the days of which we write, and of uncounted centuries before, was smallpox. Other plagues were more destructive for a time, but their duration was short, and the intervals between their appearances were long. Smallpox, however, was always lurking in some corner of every country, ready to take advantage of circumstances favourable for an epidemic. It has been estimated that 500,000 people perished annually of smallpox in Europe. The Spaniards carried it to Mexico and South America, where it committed the most frightful ravages among the Indians and the negro slaves. The English and French carried it to North America, where it exterminated whole tribes of Indians. It has ever been noticed that the disease is much more virulent and fatal among the dark races than among the light ones. America was only thinly populated with Indians when the European settlements were first planted. Of this thin population, it is estimated that 6 millions perished of smallpox in a century. One of the first cares of Ralph Morton was to exclude the scourge from his colony. His agents were continually warned against shipping persons suffering from or suspected of being infected with smallpox. When the disease became epidemic in any port of Europe, Morton's vessels ceased to visit that port until the epidemic subsided. Vessels arriving at Mortonia with the pest on board were rigidly quarantined, and all infected articles destroyed. The cleaner and more comfortable mode of living in Aristopia than that of the common people in Europe, where poverty among the masses was the mother of filth and squalor, was favourable to exemption from the scourge. But still smallpox was the terror of the world, and no hope of exemption appeared. The second wife of Ralph Morton was the daughter of a Gloucestershire farmer and dairyman. From the time of her marriage she had observed her husband's anxiety about the smallpox, and his unceasing efforts to exclude the scourge from the colony and mitigate its ravages when it gained an entrance. But it was many years before it occurred to her to tell her husband something of which she made little account, but which seemed to him of immense importance. She said it had long been known that the cows of Gloucestershire were subject to a pustular disease which could be, and sometimes was, communicated to the milkers who had chaps or abrasions of the skin upon their hands. It was believed by some that those persons who had suffered from the cowpox would not have the smallpox, or, if they did, that it would be in a very mild form. She told of a school teacher who had inoculated several children with the cowpox. These children had escaped the smallpox, even when it attacked their families. Ralph Morton had one of those fertile minds in which suggestions, falling sterile on other minds, like seeds sown upon the stones of the highway or among the bushes and brambles of the roadside, sprang up in a fruitful growth. He wondered much that if one person had observed that cowpox gave immunity from smallpox, all the world had not soon known and availed itself of the immunity. He did not make sufficient allowance for human dullness and prejudice. He pondered the matter some time, and then sent an agent to Gloucestershire to investigate. The agent reported that in fact he had found cows with the pustular disease, and by diligent inquiry learned of the existence of a tradition that the disease communicated to mankind gave immunity from smallpox. Morton then ordered 20 young heifers to be shipped from Gloucestershire to Mortonia. 2 of them on leaving England were to be inoculated with the cowpox, and during the voyage 2 other heifers should be inoculated every 10 days, so that the virus should be kept fresh. At Mortonia other heifers were to be inoculated, and thus a sufficient supply of virus would be provided. Meanwhile the governor had published the matter and called for volunteers to be vaccinated. Several physicians and many other young men responded, having great confidence in the governor's wisdom and knowledge. The governor promised to confer a title of honour upon any vaccinated physician who would go into a smallpox hospital as doctor or nurse, and to give a pension of $500 a year to the family of any person who should, while so acting as nurse or physician, contract the smallpox and die of it. There never have been lacking in any civilized community a few devoted persons willing to expose themselves to the dangers of plague in ministering to the sufferings of their fellow beings, and that without hope of extraordinary reward. Still more were thus willing when special honours were to be reaped and provision was to be made for the future of their families. The smallpox was not just then in existence in Aristopia, but in some of the other colonies there were local epidemics, and thither went Aristopians to try the efficacy of vaccination. Every one of these persons became firmly convinced that vaccination furnished either entire immunity or immunity from all except a very mild form of smallpox. Their testimony was published in newspapers, pamphlets, lectures, and by the teachers of public schools all over Aristopia. Many persons, including physicians, lent the governor their aid in urging general vaccination. When a smallpox epidemic at last broke out in Aristopia, the efficacy of vaccination was so fully demonstrated that none but strongly prejudiced persons longer disbelieved. The good news that here at last was protection from the world's terror was published far and near. It might be supposed that all would gladly hail and quickly avail themselves of the protection. Not so. Mighty indeed is human prejudice, invincible when fortified with religious superstition. Nowhere in the civilized world outside of Aristopia was there sufficient freedom from bigotry to allow vaccination to be adopted. For the 16th and 17th centuries were the acme of religious fanaticism in the world's history. The pulpit everywhere thundered against the impiety of vaccination. Smallpox was a wise dispensation of Providence to rid the poor man of the burden of his numerous family. It was a fitting punishment for the sins of the proud and impious. To attempt to escape from or abolish it was sacrilege. Passages of Scripture were searched out and pieced together to prove that vaccination was even anti-Christ. The miracle mongers of the Church did not fail to find warning portents. Ox-faced boys and cow-faced girls were known, it was said, to be born of mothers who had been vaccinated. God's wrath was called down upon the impious who attempted thus to escape his scourge, a scourge intended in mercy, as they were too blind to see. Thus, for a century after Aristopia enjoyed practical exemption from the scourge, Europe suffered on, until at last the fierce fever of bigotry so far subsided as to leave fair room for reason, when the whole civilized world, except a small prejudiced minority, availed itself of the boon first made public by Ralph Morton. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. The terrible storm of civil war in England between the partisans of the king and those of the Parliament was almost unfelt in the American colonies, and especially in Aristopia. Its principal effect was to send many royalist refugees to Virginia when the king's cause met with final disaster, and many to Aristopia of those who abhorred the excesses of both sides. Though Governor Morton had little cause to complain of Charles I, he naturally hoped the struggle might pave the way for a republic in England. Seeing in Cromwell, after the execution of Charles, the man in whom he thought lay England's only hope of extrication from the anarchy into which the factions of Parliament had plunged the country, he sent that general £10,000 to assist him. In 1649 Governor Morton went to Holland with a large amount of gold to arrange some business in person, being also desirous of seeing Europe again. At this time Cromwell was in Ireland subduing that country, which had taken up arms for Charles II. The Irish were completely defeated, and so reduced to despair that an immense body of them determined to emigrate. Word came to Holland that they were assembled on the western coast of Ireland, awaiting vessels to take them away. Governor Morton promptly resolved to take them to Aristopia. He quickly sent word to the captains of all his own vessels whom he could reach to sail immediately to the coast of Ireland, and take as many Irish as possible to Mortonia, if they would go. He also employed a large number of Dutch vessels for the same purpose. As the Irish who were determined on self-exile had no particular destination in view, Morton's agents easily induced them to go to Aristopia, on promise of profitable employment and political and religious liberty. More than 40,000 Irish, mostly men, thus expatriated themselves. Cromwell, desirous of ridding the island of these intractable subjects of the English government, gave them ample time to embark. Of the 40,000, more than 25,000, including nearly all of the small proportion of women and children among the exiles, went to Aristopia. It is certain that Governor Morton averted a vast amount of human misery by his action, for terrible indeed would have been the sufferings of those poverty-stricken exiles, inured although they were to hardships, if they had been thrown in great masses, ignorant of the language, manners, and industries of the countries to which they might have gone, into any other community than Aristopia, with its unique governor. It was a very hazardous experiment to throw a mass of semi-barbarous people like the Irish of that age into a new colony, and the colonists murmured much when they learned of it. The Irish were accounted by the English as little more civilized than the Indians, and quite as hopeless of civilization. But Governor Morton did not share these prejudices. He knew that the Irish were rude, ignorant, and half savage in their manners, but he also knew that this rudeness was not inherent in the race, as in the Indians. He remembered that, some centuries before, Ireland had been the seat of by far the highest civilization of which Western Europe could boast, and that their present degradation was the result of hideous misgovernment. under good government he was sure the Irish would rise from their degradation and recover their ancient civilization. He wanted only industrious citizens in Aristopia. The English of that time, and for centuries afterward, were never tired of descanting on Irish sloth. Says Macaulay, "The Irish peasant feared not danger half so much as work." But Governor Morton had read history enough to know that no misgoverned people are ever industrious, because they have no incentive to produce anything of which they would probably be robbed. No civilized race, well governed, has shown a lack of the industry necessary to obtain a comfortable living. To feed this army, almost as great as was then the whole population of Virginia and Maryland combined, in a new country, until they could produce something from the soil, was no small task. The governor had several shiploads of wheat and barley shipped promptly from Holland, then a mart for every commodity, and as soon as possible sent word to Aristopia to export no more grain. When the fleet bearing this army of immigrants arrived, the Potomac was whitened with sails like the Thames, and the river bank from Mortonia far down was fringed with masts like the docks of London. The horseboats worked night and day with relays of men and horses towing the ships up the river. As the Irish were known to be turbulent, a considerable force of militia was kept in readiness as a police. About 5,000 of the Irish were put at work on the canal along the upper Potomac, and the rest were marched over the mountains. Many of them had been fishermen in Ireland. These were selected and set to fishing on the lower Potomac and the Chesapeake. The fish they caught were salted and sent to feed the Irish immigrants. Part of the Irish were assisted in making themselves farmers. Some were employed by private individuals, more on public works by the Commonwealth, and the rest by the governor at his private expense. Though wild and turbulent at first, and requiring considerable extra police force, they gradually improved. Paid fair wages, and encouraged by every possible means to desire and attain a higher and more comfortable condition of life than they had known before, their improvement was rapid. In a few years they went far to justify Governor Morton's opinion of their capacity for civilization, and their children did so completely. As soon as possible the governor's agents sought out and brought over the families of such of the immigrants as had left families in Ireland. Some of the most intelligent of the immigrants were selected and sent back to Ireland to assist in inducing enough young Irish women to come over to mate the unmarried men. In the distracted and impoverished state of the country, with myriads of their young men slain in their struggle with the conquering English and thousands exiled, it was not difficult to find shiploads of surplus women, many of them lone and homeless, and only too glad to accept any offered refuge. The victories of Cromwell gave another peculiar accession to the population of Aristopia, but a much smaller one than that of the Irish exiles. Nearly 200 of the Scotch captured at the Battle of Worcester in 1651 were shipped to Virginia to be sold into servitude, something which sounds very strange in this age. Governor Morton bought the whole lot before they were landed. They were then informed that if they would take the oath of allegiance to the government of Aristopia, and especially an oath never to molest their neighbours by word or deed in the free exercise of their religious faith, for the Scotch of that day were generally furious zealots in religion, they would be allowed their freedom in Aristopia, where in due time they might become citizens. Otherwise they would be resold in Virginia. The offer was unanimously accepted, although it was a bitter pill to most of these Covenanters to swear not to do their utmost against Popish dogs and recusants, if not against less heinous heretics and antichrists. but in the course of years the savage zeal of these men abated so much that they were content merely to think evil of their neighbours who were in spiritual darkness, without saying much or doing anything violent to enlighten them. The families of such of them as had families in Scotland were brought over to Aristopia. The fleet which brought these Scotch prisoners came over to "reduce" Virginia, which had declared for the king. The work of reduction was very speedily performed. The Parliamentary Commissioners made very favourable terms for the Virginians. Indeed, they left them more freedom and self-government than the king had given them. Maryland, as a Catholic colony, was "reduced" to the extent of rendering Catholics incompetent to hold office, and putting the local government into the hands of the few Puritans the colony contained. Aristopia had not rendered itself obnoxious to the Parliamentary party, and was not molested. The rule of the Rump and the protectorates of Oliver and Richard Cromwell passed away without any event of importance in the relations of England and the colonies. The short war with Holland and the Navigation Act of Parliament hardly interrupted the trade of the colonies with the Dutch. For many years after the accession of Charles II, the king and Parliament were too intent on watching each other to pay much attention to the colonies. At last Charles had sufficient leisure to inflict two of his favourites, Arlington and Culpeper, on Virginia, which was unfortunate enough to be the favourite of the Stuarts. Large grants of land were given to these rapacious parasites, whom the Virginians finally bought off. Another such favourite was about to be inflicted on Aristopia, when Governor Morton's agents succeeded, by the payment of £20,000, in inducing the king to renounce his intention, and sign a solemn promise that the charter given by his grandfather should be for ever respected to the letter. That charter had given Governor Morton the right to levy customs, and had exempted the colony from the levying of royal customs within its borders. But the terms of this exemption were vague, and Governor Morton had much difficulty in keeping his colony free from royal spies in the form of customs officers. He wished to conceal from the English government the proceedings of the Commonwealth, and the fact that Aristopia was exporting largely of its manufactures, a fact which, if fully known, would have aroused the jealousy of the English government and provoked restrictive legislation. It is popularly but erroneously supposed in America that restrictive legislation against manufacturing in the colonies began with the colonization, but in fact it was more than a century after the founding of Jamestown before the English manufacturers awoke to the fact that America was manufacturing for herself, and before they obtained power enough in Parliament to procure restrictive legislation. Charles II died, and James II became King of England in 1685. His arbitrary and tyrannical career as Lord Proprietor and Governor of the colonies of New York and New Jersey while he was Duke of York prepared him for arbitrary measures with the colonies when he became King of Great Britain. One of these measures was to send over one of his favourites, George Arundel, as Governor of Aristopia, in the place of the venerable Governor Morton, then nearly 100 years old, although this was in flagrant violation of the charter. The royalist governor came to Morgania, the capital of Aristopia, and very much surprised he was to find flourishing and highly civilized communities where he expected to find the scattered settlements and rude huts of a few thousand semi-barbarous colonists. Mortonia was a city of several thousand inhabitants, with many public buildings, all of brick or stone, with slate roofs. The dwelling houses were mostly of wood, neatly painted, and glass windows were more plentiful than in London. All the land from the eastern branch to Rock Creek, and much above the creek, was a close succession of well-cultivated farms, orchards, vineyards, and gardens. The land along the river, too moist for cultivation, was an expanse of green meadows. Morgania was considerably larger and more flourishing than Mortonia. The new governor never went beyond Morgania, and never learned the greatness of the civilized communities which stretched far down the Ohio. The system of government of Aristopia required of its chief executive little action in the way of ruling. He was rather the chief clerk of a business bureau than a ruler. Thus, while the royalist governor imagined he was governing the colony, the work of this bureau went on without any reference to him. At last, finding that no attention was paid to his edicts, he began to bluster and threaten. Then the real head of the Commonwealth, the venerable Governor Morton, ordered several thousand of the well-drilled militia of Aristopia to Morgania, and displayed them before the nominal ruler. It was then suggested to Arundel that he could probably rule Aristopia much better through a lieutenant governor while residing in London than by remaining in Morgania. Governor Morton promised to pay him an annual pension of double the salary he was receiving. Arundel was not a very wise man, but he was no fool. He saw that governing Aristopia in reality would be for him a very troublesome work. Then, too, he was an aristocrat, and the democratic civilization of Aristopia, so different from that of England, however well it might suit Aristopians, was distasteful to him. He much preferred life in London, especially with a double salary. So one fine day he climbed into a 6-horse coach, and with his retinue of servants at his back, turned his face toward the Atlantic and left Morgania, amid the blare of much martial music, the waving of many Red Cross flags, and the booming of cannons. All this was ostensibly in loyal honour of their departing guest and ruler, but it might have occurred even to Arundel that the demonstrations were rather an ironical honour. Arundel left as his lieutenant Henry Morgan, a brother-in-law of Governor Morton's son. The nominal lieutenant governor never had the slightest idea of exercising any of the functions of governor, and after the departure of Arundel, the government of Aristopia moved on exactly as before his coming. The cautious old governor would rather pay out a few £1,000s than to plunge the Commonwealth into a struggle with the king, or let the royalist tool remain to meddle with the affairs of the Commonwealth. But Arundel's pension was of short duration. The reckless and stubborn James so aroused England against himself that he was forced to abdicate in 1688, and Dutch William ascended the English throne. The pension to the nominal governor of Aristopia was immediately stopped, and the tool of the exiled king saw the hopelessness of any attempt to enforce the payment. In the first year of the reign of James II, the Duke of Monmouth, an illegitimate son of Charles II, raised an insurrection, which was speedily suppressed. 1,000 of his followers were sold into servitude. Governor Morton's agents bought and shipped nearly all of them to Aristopia. Their joy may be imagined when they found themselves freemen in the New World, with brighter prospects than they had ever hoped for in their most prosperous days. They were mostly agricultural peasants, material from which useful citizens might be made. The families of such of them as had families were brought to them. Toward the end of this same year, 1685, began the greatest immigration into Aristopia which ever occurred in so short a time. The arrogant and despotic King of France revoked the Edict of Nantes, by which the Protestants of France had for many years enjoyed a small degree of religious liberty. The high-spirited Huguenots resolved not to remain and endure the terrible persecutions which quickly followed the revocation, and they soon began a wholesale emigration. Many of the French Huguenots had already come to Aristopia. Some of these were immediately sent back to France to co-operate with Governor Morton's agency, which was well organised in France, in inducing the exiles to come to Aristopia. The number of these exiles is variously estimated at from 300,000 to 500,000. So well directed were the efforts of Morton's agency, supported with abundant means, and so great the inducements offered, that more than 100,000 of these Huguenots came to Aristopia in a single year. They came in unbroken families. They were among the most skilful mechanics and agriculturists of France, high-spirited and intelligent, possessing most of the high virtues and noble qualities of the English Puritans, without their gloomy austerity and savage bigotry, and they soon became excellent citizens of their adopted country. Some were men of great learning, capable of becoming professors in the higher institutions of learning in Aristopia. The manner of the Huguenots' exile rendered it easy to direct their emigration to Aristopia, and very fortunate it was for them that such an asylum and such assistance in reaching it were at hand. The emigration of the Huguenots was made a felony, and the frontiers were guarded to prevent it. The property of the dying Protestant was by law left to the one of his family who should renounce his religion. Soldiers were quartered in Huguenot families to prevent them from the exercise of their religion, and to guard against their emigration. Those who escaped must leave their property behind. Sad enough and hard enough is the lot of the exile when he can take a little property with him, but infinitely harder when thrown empty-handed among a strange and unsympathizing people, not the strong man with only his own wants to provide for, but the father with his wife and babes. What fortune, then, to find free passage to a land where nature's bounty was lavish and to a great extent unappropriated, and to a Commonwealth whose leading principle was the public weal, not the greed of gain at the expense of others, whose motto was non sibi sed aliis, not for one's self but for others. The Huguenots, adding their peculiar qualities to those of the English, Germans, and Irish, very greatly and beneficially influenced the new composite nation. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. The Venerable Ralph Morton lived but a few months after the abdication of James. He was in his 100th year. To very few of the human race is it given to live and retain their faculties for a round century. Well would it be if all these centenarians were such as Ralph Morton. For many years he had left to a subordinate the arduous labours of the Chief Executive's office, and had undertaken no task beyond his strength. He became rather an adviser than an executive. Feeling that his end was near, and wishing to see his successor installed, he resigned his office. The people elected his son Charles as governor for a term of 5 years. Ralph Morton had married, when about 30, a young and comely woman who had come over to Mortonia to teach school. By this union he had no son who survived him. At the age of about 50 he had married again, and Charles Morton was the oldest son by this marriage. This son was, what too few sons of great and good men are, entirely worthy of his father. Free from avarice, arrogance, love of ostentation and luxury, desiring power and wealth only that he might do good with them. A philanthropist with an abiding faith in the ultimate high destiny of the human race, an earnest friend of progress, but opposing change for the mere sake of novelty. Without bigotry, believing that the truest and most acceptable worship of God is the doing good to his creatures. He was the man above all others whom Ralph Morton desired as his successor, although he had never urged his election, which was a spontaneous tribute of a grateful people to a benefactor whom they could little requite for all his benefactions. Ralph Morton bequeathed to the Commonwealth in fee simple all the lands of which the Royal Charter made him Lord Proprietor, except a few acres about the mine, with the condition that the cardinal principles of the Constitution in respect to private ownership and monopoly of soil, forests, mines, waters, etc., should never be violated. In case of such violation, the lands in respect to which the violation should occur should immediately revert to the heirs of Ralph Morton. He gave to each of his living children and the representatives of such as were dead $10,000, with the request that they should use the advantages the wealth gave them for the benefit of their country and humanity. The mine he gave to his son Charles, on receiving a solemn pledge that the gold should be used for the public good. The stone had been dug away from the mass for its whole length and depth, down to where, in miners' phrase, the deposit pinched out. Several millions of dollars' worth were still left, sufficient for many years of use in assisting immigration, maintaining institutions of learning, and aiding the advancement of science. To these uses the new Governor Morton resolved to devote the gold. At the time of his retirement, Governor Ralph Morton issued a farewell address to the people of Aristopia, which, in the main, he had composed many years before, while his mental powers were in full vigour, only modifying it somewhat as the flight of years opened to him new views and furnished him new illustrations. He not only drew upon the historical studies of his youth, but on the experiences of his long life. He had kept himself fully informed, by means of his wide correspondence, of all public events of both Europe and America. He urged his people to guard their liberties with unremitting and unending vigilance. He pointed out the dangers to which these liberties would be exposed, and whence would probably come the assaults upon them. That these assaults would not be bold, abrupt, and open, but stealthy, insidious, and gradual. With every succeeding generation, the dangers to popular liberty from the despotism of hereditary monarchy and aristocracy would grow less. With increasing and advancing civilization, another kind of despotism, the despotism of wealth, would become more and more dangerous. This despotism might be hereditary, the slow growth of generations, or it might be the sudden growth of a score or two of years. In a new country, where so much of nature's wealth was unappropriated, and so wide a scope was offered for those excelling in greed, cunning, and strength to grasp this unappropriated wealth, the sudden acquisition of great riches might be looked for in many cases. He warned the people that the greatest dangers to liberty might be covered by the most specious pleas for liberty itself. He warned them that the wealthy and strong would plead for liberty, the liberty to oppress the weak and helpless, to rob them, not boldly and openly with the coarse methods of the highwayman, but stealthily and under the pretence of fair and open business. But the result would be exactly that accomplished by the highwaymen, the acquisition of wealth without rendering an equivalent. Absolute equality of wealth, however desirable, could not be attained except in a community in which the individual was controlled in all financial matters by the society. Otherwise the improvident and incapable would surely become and remain poor. As society is obliged in the end to care for the improvident and incapable, it is a question when that care ought to begin, and how far prevention ought to be substituted for alleviation, especially when it is considered that the incapable one is often the head of a family, dragging down to poverty those naturally dependent upon him. but without any question prevention ought to be used against the great and dangerous accumulation of wealth by individuals and associations not public. Great wealth in the hands of a few must with the utmost certainty be balanced by the poverty of many. The dangers and injustice to society of this are so great that no specious plea for liberty must be allowed to cover the acquisition of undue wealth. The liberty of the strong and capable to get all they can and keep all they get, although obtained at the expense of the weak and incapable, is only the liberty of the highwayman, glossed over and refined by subtle methods. The liberty of the bold and strong to do as they please with the weak and timid, the liberty of the shrewd and cunning to deal as they can and will with the simple and uncalculating, is a sort of anarchy. He warned the people especially against the dangers from corporations, which were then beginning to grow strong in England. He had seen a good specimen of corporation rule in the early settlement of Virginia. A corporation is the very worst of rulers. It has all the vices of the avarice, greed, selfishness, and cruelty of all its members combined, and increased in geometrical ratio by the combination, with none of the virtues of the benevolence and generosity of its separate members. It is deaf to the voice of mercy, insensible to the pangs of remorse and the scourge of shame, and untouched by the sentiment of gratitude. Vain against corporations are laws relating to heredity, for corporations may perpetuate themselves and live through generations. Above all, he warned the people against giving a corporation any monopoly. Dangerous and evil as is any monopoly in the hands of an individual, in the grasp of a corporation its evil is multiplied infinitely. Although a corporation has no soul, it may have a head, who, wielding its vast power with a single will, may make of himself a most dangerous despot. This paper, of which only a brief, dry outline is here given, was written with a vividness of colour, a depth and warmth of feeling, an aptness of expression, a strength of argument, a force and fire and fervour, which were possible only to a man of high genius, with a soul aflame with love of right and hatred of wrong. The address became a classic in Aristopia, and was read and declaimed by every youth in every school for generation after generation. Its influence was greater than that of future presidents and congresses. Its maxims had more than the force of laws. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. The arduous task of King William in firmly establishing the throne which he had acquired in so peculiar a manner left him little time in the early part of his reign to meddle with the American colonies. But in after years he reduced Maryland to a royal colony, and meddled considerably with the Charter of Massachusetts, probably because the proprietor of the former colony was a Catholic, while the latter colony was offensively Puritan. But Aristopia came little under his notice. His campaign against the exiled King James in Ireland led to further measures against that unhappy country resembling those of Cromwell. Nearly the whole Irish population of the province of Ulster was driven out. Many thousands of these exiles were brought to Aristopia, where they furnished very crude, but in the end very valuable material for citizenship, as we have seen in the case of those driven out by Cromwell. By the time those were settled in Aristopia, the valley of the Ohio, from its source at the junction of the Allegheny and the Monongahela to its mouth, was thickly settled. At the junction just mentioned, the flourishing town called Columbus was established, and became the seat of an extensive iron-smelting industry. The old trading posts on the Ohio and the Mississippi had become large towns. New trading posts had been established far westward up the Missouri and northward up the Mississippi. Lead in abundance had been discovered in the region west of the Mississippi, not far from that river, and considerable mining settlements had been formed. Zinc ore was also found in the vicinity of the lead ore. The Indians who came to trade at the posts on the upper Mississippi had knives, hatchets, and arrowheads cast of copper, evidently of native manufacture. Some of the Indians revealed the existence of large deposits of pure metallic copper, which they said were situated near the shores of a vast lake or freshwater sea far to the north. These Indians were induced by rich presents to conduct an exploring party to the mines. With the party were experts in minerals and a mathematician to determine the latitude and longitude of the places visited. The party set out from a post on the Mississippi, about 500 miles by river above the mouth of the Missouri, and travelled nearly 400 miles in a northerly direction, over rugged hills and broad plains, narrow prairies and extensive forests, first of hardwoods and later of great pines. At last they came to the shore of a lake so vast that it seemed like a sea. Near the lake they found many outcroppings of metallic copper and copper ore, with indications that much greater quantities could be obtained by mining. The Indians informed the explorers that another great lake lay off to the southeast of the copper mines, on which they could, by going southward, reach a point less than 6 days' journey from the Mississippi. It was determined that on reaching this lake a few of the party should go by canoes as far as possible, leaving the rest of the party to return by nearly the same route as they came. Crossing the peninsula separating the two great lakes, a party of 5 white men, including the mathematician, and 2 Indian guides, embarked in birch canoes and set out southward along the shore of the great and solitary lake. After a long journey southward, they found the shore of the lake trending too much to the east, when they abandoned their canoes and struck out on foot over the vast prairie, with the setting sun as their guide. In due time they reached the great river, and were soon at a trading post. Copper was a metal very much needed in Aristopia. Unalloyed and in brass and bronze, it was far better adapted to many uses than iron, which was very plentiful in the country. There was plenty of zinc from which to make brass, but all the copper used had to be imported from Europe. So it was decided by the government of Aristopia to take possession of these copper mines, although they were far beyond the charter limits of the Commonwealth. The Illinois River, emptying into the Mississippi about 25 miles above the mouth of the Missouri, could be ascended by horseboats to within about 100 miles of the shore of the great Lake Michigan. At this head of navigation a post was established, a fort was built of prairie sods and armed with 3 6-pound cannons. Houses were built of lumber brought up on the boats. For the post on Lake Michigan, a point was selected at the mouth of a small river called the Chicago. The mouth of the river would form a port for vessels used on the lake. As there was no timber for building and fuel here, a post was not immediately established, but a strong party with all the necessary tools was sent northward along the shore of the lake until a spot was found where there was plenty of good timber and a small river running into the lake, which would furnish water power for a sawmill. Here a post called Sheboygan was established and a sawmill erected. From the lumber sawn, 2 sailing vessels were built. The first one, which was finished immediately, took a cargo of lumber to the mouth of the Chicago River, where a post called Chicago was established. The western and northern shores of Lake Michigan were explored with a view to finding a passage into the other lake, called Lake Tracy or Superior. It was found, however, that in the river between the 2 lakes were rapids which prevented navigation, so another post, called Escanaba, was established at the head of a little bay at the north end of Lake Michigan. From this point a road was cut through the woods to the shore of Lake Superior, a distance of about 45 miles. On the shore of Lake Superior another post called Fort Nina was established and another sawmill erected. A vessel of about 20 tons was built to ply between Fort Nina and the mines, where a post called Fort Copper was established. In this systematic and thorough manner a line of communication was established between the western settlements of Aristopia and the far-off northern mines, which left only 2 short journeys overland to be made. Thus, before the end of the 17th century, the white sails of staunch vessels manned by English-speaking crews could be seen on these lonely inland seas, of whose very existence the people of England were ignorant, supposing that in their place rolled the salt waves of the great South Sea. This extension of the outposts of Aristopia not only supplied the colony with a large amount of copper, but greatly increased its fur trade by extending it into a new region. In this high northern latitude, too, the furs were of the best quality. The determination which Ralph Morton took to occupy with his colony the interior instead of the coast region, with the results that flowed from that determination, effectually blocked a game which France had begun to play more than a century before the events described in this chapter, viz., the occupation of the interior of the vast continent which the English for a long time thought so narrow, and of which they seized only the Atlantic coast. The fur traders of the French early pushed up the St. Lawrence to Lake Ontario, and later the ardent and courageous missionaries went much farther. Later still a French colony occupied the lower Mississippi, and the natural result would have been a final union of these colonies by the pathway of the Mississippi, Ohio, and the Great Lakes. But the settlements of Aristopia blocked the way. In 1673 a party composed of Marquette, a missionary who had spent several years in the region of the Great Lakes, Joliet, a Quebec trader, 5 other Frenchmen, and 2 Algonquins, ascended a river flowing into Lake Michigan to a place where a short portage enabled them to launch their canoes in another broad but shallow river flowing south-westward. This river was named by the French Wisconsin, later spelled Wisconsin. Here the Indian guides deserted the party, and the Frenchmen proceeded down the stream in search of a greater river of which they had heard. After 7 days of floating and paddling they came into this great river and began to descend. They saw indeed a magnificent stream, its great volume in some places flowing in one broad channel, at other places dividing and running among islands covered to the water's edge with willow and birch. The valley they saw flanked with high bluffs, in places rising in smooth green ramparts crowned with oak groves, in other places perpendicular limestone cliffs. Descending 100 miles, the valley broadened out, and the great bluffs sunk into low rounded hills. The water rippled clear in the sunshine on the sandy banks, sprinkled with many-hued pebbles, for here the great river had not been polluted by the turbid tide of the Missouri. They had been told by the Indians that white men were settled on the banks of the great river, but they concluded that in their imperfect knowledge of the language they had misunderstood. They were sure the region had never been seen by any Europeans except themselves. Great, then, was their surprise when, after descending about 250 miles from the mouth of the Wisconsin, and supposing themselves in a vast solitude, so far from civilization that the thought was overawing, they saw upon the eastern bank a village of about 50 houses, with outlying farms and farmhouses, all of civilized style, and a fort over which floated the well-known flag of England, and a banner bearing 3 bars of red, white, and blue. Going ashore, they learned that it was the outpost of the colony of Aristopia, and was called a caulker. The Frenchmen had heard of Aristopia, but had not supposed that its outposts were within 500 miles of the great river. When they learned that down the river were other towns, one of which contained 1,500 inhabitants, Joliet said to Marquette, "These cursed English will populate the whole earth some time." "Meanwhile," answered Marquette, "they bar the way to the spread of the true religion of the Holy Cross among the heathen of this fair land." The bright visions in which the Frenchmen had been indulging while floating down the great river, of seeing this noble valley, with a climate so much more genial than that of the St. Lawrence, peopled with Frenchmen, vanished. They saw that France was completely forestalled. After a few days' rest, being treated very hospitably, they returned to New France as they came. The war which broke out between France and England on the accession of William III, and lasted, with a short intermission, until 1713, into which the American colonies were dragged, had no effect on Aristopia. The French and their allies, the Algonquins, made from their posts on the St. Lawrence several bloody raids on the exposed settlements of New England and eastern New York, accompanied with great atrocities. But the powerful Iroquois, the implacable enemies of the French and the allies of the English, barred the way of the French to the west, compelling them to evacuate Forts Niagara and Frontenac, respectively, at the inlet and outlet of Lake Ontario. The Mohawks, one of the Iroquois tribes, even made a bloody raid on Montreal. The French afterward made peace with the Iroquois, but during the war had not force enough west of Niagara Falls to threaten Aristopia. Chapter 20.